This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Joshua Dunn his latest book, Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. The book is co-authored with John Shields. Joshua Dunn, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
So on thinking about this book, Passing on the Right, we all know there's no shortage of books by conservatives bemoaning the state of higher education. So maybe at one end we have books by David Horowitz or Roger Kimball. I mean, his book Tenured Radicals was had a big influence, which argues that, basically we have enclaves of, Soviet Moscow or East Berlin on American college campuses. But then we have maybe this other perspective on the other end of the tenured progressive professor who insists there's no problem here. Everything is fine. There's complete diversity of thought on campus. And if there aren't that many conservatives in his department or her department, the problem is it because of progressivism? It's that conservatives really don't have the chops for academia. They don't have the creative open-mindedness, the willingness to explore questions. They do things like banking. They do things like engineering, et cetera. Your book occupies a middle ground there, I think, and you're willing to see problems that conservatives face, but you also note how they're thriving and the strategies they use to thrive as well. Describe this book, though, Passing on the Right, and what you and your co-author did, the research you did, and then the conclusions you came to.
Sure. First, I think you are correct that the book does end up occupying something of a middle ground. We didn't set out to do that. We really, when we started the research, we just were interested in exploring what this understudied population of the academy actually looked like. And so then after our interviews with these conservative faculty in 6 disciplines, we interviewed 153 professors in 3 disciplines from the social sciences: sociology, economics, and political science, and then 3 from the humanities: literature, history, and philosophy. We didn't start out saying, well, we're going to say that things aren't as bad as conservatives sometimes say, and that there's no problem at all, like many on the left will often say. That really did emerge from our interviews and surveys of these faculty. I also it might be better to describe it as that in some ways we indicate that things are better for conservatives than they often think, but also in some ways that they're worse. Some disciplines, I was surprised at how difficult it was to actually find conservatives. I knew it would be more difficult in some disciplines than others to find conservatives. But in sociology, for instance, and literature, it was much more difficult than I expected. Other disciplines like economics, it was very easy to find, and also in disciplines like economics, and to some extent political science, depending on the nature of your research and the type of institution you're at. Conservatives also did not feel terribly oppressed because of their ideology.
How are you? How did you define conservative? You and your co-author in this. Sure,
yeah. Right. We wrestled with that for a long time because, as you know, and as I'm certain your listeners know, the conservative movement is a coalition, and there's intense debate among conservatives for who or what counts as a conservative and how to define the term. So we ended up just saying if we left it up to the people that we approached to say whether or not they were conservative or libertarian, because libertarians are generally considered part of this conservative coalition, but often they are hesitant to describe themselves as a conservative. But they're on the right politically if you look at a left-right spectrum, kind of a simple spectrum. And so we just left it up to them, and we said if you were willing to self-identify as a conservative, would you be willing to be interviewed for this project? So that let us avoid the very difficult and perhaps impossible task of coming up with a definition of conservative that would satisfy everyone.
Yeah, so you stuck to maybe James Caesar's idea of, 4 heads and 1 heart, and that
right,
coalition
exactly.
model. Yeah. Yeah. So
Yes, or as James Caesar said, that conservatives are united by two self-evident truths: Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Boxer. So, in some ways, so if you consider yourself in opposition to them, then maybe you kind of the conservative. Yes.
so maybe, I mean, one thing too. So you and your co-author, you personally interviewed 153 professors, and as you
Yes.
were discussing, in a range of disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, and in a range of different types of conservatives. We talk about those interviews. I mean, you start the book with, say, a rather paranoid professor who wouldn't meet with you on campus. He wanted to meet off campus
Right.
at a park, and he's scared to even talk to you at times. Anytime someone walked by, he clams up and looks around. So I thought that was an interesting way to begin the book. But talk about your interviews and how did you get this list of people?
Sure. Yeah, that was a very telling interview. That was very early in the project on our first round of interviews. So one of the difficulties was actually locating self-identified conservatives, and so we decided to use a snowball sample as our primary method. We were able to compile a list of conservatives just from different publications and organizations. But then we would approach them, email them, and ask them to identify 10 other conservatives that we might be able to approach and ask to be interviewed. And there's the fact that we had to use a snowball sample itself is I think interesting, because you normally use a snowball sample with difficult to locate populations, like the homeless, people with no fixed address. So you go down to the homeless encampment and ask them, where can I find more people like you? Because it's otherwise impossible to find them. And so that's what we had to do in order to locate enough conservatives. At least in political science and economics, we could have probably found enough conservatives without a snowball sample. But outside of those disciplines, it was essential for us to be able to come up with a list.
And I suppose maybe you didn't want to just rely on academics in the Claremont Review of Books or National Review or Weekly Standard or Modern Age or various libertarian journals, because those, in my mind, would tend to be very successful academics, probably tenured or at least more senior, and might give you a more I don't know if a rosy outlook, but a more comfortable understanding of their own situation. And you probably really wanted to find, you did want to talk to the guy who's teaching 4 courses a semester, probably hasn't published much and isn't at a very prestigious university, at a teaching university, and could give you that perspective also.
Oh, exactly. So we wanted scholars and professors from a range of institutions. So we interviewed everyone from community colleges up through Research One universities. And then I do know that there was some discussion when word about our project got out in some disciplines. I know in particular in history, there was some discussion among more senior scholars about whether or not they would disclose names of junior scholars to us, ones who had not been tenured, because they were some of them, I think, were concerned about our motives. They thought, and we actually had some faculty tell us, they thought it was a red scare for the right. We're going to identify all the conservatives so they could be outed and then exercised from the university.
Yeah, well, interesting. And so within the book, economists and libertarians are almost a separate category in my mind.
Right.
And of course, they report very few problems or much fewer problems. And then a lot of the economists are libertarians, and they report within their discipline, their insights and basic approaches about human behavior are largely confirmed by their discipline, and all is well, seemingly. It seems. Is that an accurate read of your book?
That's accurate. I wouldn't say for all libertarians outside of economics that's the case. There were a couple of sociologists who had more libertarian leanings, and I wouldn't say that life is particularly comfortable politically for them within their discipline because of the Marxist elements that are still so strong in sociology. But on the whole, life is much easier for self-described or self-identifying libertarians. And for economists, they almost felt no sense of persecution or sense of isolation. When we would give a survey after our interviews to economists, to all of the people that we interviewed, and it was designed to measure their political attitudes, but then also to measure their sense of persecution might not be the right word, but did they feel like they had to hide their politics, those kinds of things in a more objective way. And we had economists who were taking the survey just look up at us and say, do these questions actually matter for people in other disciplines? they couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
So, they're incredibly isolated in some ways because economics has been so, in a way, depoliticized. And there's a very economists have a kind of a broadly shared understanding of what their discipline is supposed to be doing and the methods it's supposed to be doing, and that has the effect of sort of dampening these political controversies.
Something interesting in your book, so why are there so many progressives in academia? And so there's a self-congratulatory or self-affirming narrative that progressives give of just mindset and personality and willingness to be interested in questions that maybe don't lead to a career of that's going to make you a lot of money or give you a lot of prestige or be very practical in society, but they're willing to forego all of that because of their own interest in truth or challenging paradigms or things like that. And then the other understanding we notice, because there's a systematic campaign of discrimination against conservatives. Safe to say in your book you dismiss that. But you do note, just it is the case that there is a surprising number of progressives who go into graduate school and a much smaller number of conservatives who make that choice. Talk about that. What just right there's at the beginning of one's academic career, choosing to go to grad school, choosing to get a PhD. Talk about that. Do you think that's because a lot of conservative students just are already thinking, well, my prospects are going to be fewer because I'm a conservative. Already there are not that many jobs out. Maybe I just shouldn't go that route. Do you find that to be working, that a significant explanation, or is it something like conservatives just aren't that interested in being academic?
Right. Well, first I would say on the discrimination part, I wouldn't say that there's no evidence of systematic discrimination. There is some. George Yancey's work, for instance, is, I think, very good on this, where he sent surveys to sociologists and asked them about how different characteristics of potential job applicants would affect their willingness to hire them. And they just often confess that if someone was a Republican or someone was a conservative or someone was a member of the NRA or someone was an evangelical, that they would be much less likely to hire them or be willing to hire them. And so that was an interesting, and there have been other surveys that have confirmed that result, because normally you have to be really tricky to get academics to just admit that they're willing to discriminate.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say, but we do say that it's probably not as severe, at least in some disciplines, as conservatives sometimes say. Now, go ahead.
No. Well, sociology was the one discipline you reported, or it seemed to be the one discipline that stuck out in my mind, where like 3% or 6% of those who are sociologists identify as conservative. I mean, it's a really small number. It seems to be a discipline itself,
right,
shaped by Marxist thought to begin with. A lot of people.
Exactly. There's a good book by Christian Smith on the kind of the spiritual commitments of sociology. He's a sociologist at Notre Dame, and talking about how the discipline has been shaped by this. It's almost a kind of religious mission where it's all emancipation, it's all the eradication of hierarchies, and so that really animates the discipline. And so if you aren't committed to that spiritual enterprise, then you're going to be outside of the congregation by default, and so it makes it much more difficult for conservatives or even moderates to exist within sociology.
So okay, keep going. Sorry.
But then the question on why don't conservatives go to graduate school? I think the part of it is self-selection. This is where Neil Gross's book on the academy, why are professors liberal and why do conservatives care? I think it's fairly good on this point, that he argues that the university has been typed as a progressive institution ever since the modern university really began in the late 1800s. And I think there is some power to that explanation. And then you combine that with some sense of looming discrimination against you if you're a bright conservative undergraduate. And then you combine that with the lack of jobs, and then other career opportunities look more promising to you.
Yeah, no, that's largely what I would think. But of course, we say typed. One of the things about the progressive university model, say the University of Wisconsin, where it would be this active agent of social, economic, and political change within a state. And certainly that seems to be working in the way a lot of universities, a lot of faculty self-understand their mission with regard to their students, or with regard even to their local political environment.
Right, sure. They view their job as being one of activism.
Yeah.
And not all faculty are like that, but there's a significant percentage. And then you can, of course, think of particular departments that have developed that really have a political mission at their core. Of course, the racial and ethnic studies departments, women's studies departments, those departments. Those are obviously political to their core.
Interesting though, and thinking about your book. So we started out by saying your book kind of occupies a middle ground on this idea that conservatives are or are not systematically discriminated against. But you notice you employ the metaphor of coming out, of coming out, particularly once you receive tenure, which would seem to imply there's a big problem there. And you also note in your findings, I think, was it a third of the people you interviewed reporting self-censoring, and that self-censorship took various forms. But all of that would seem to suggest if there isn't an environment of profound discrimination, it's because a lot of people are very astute and know how to hide who they are. In many cases, people told you they went out, they looked for ways like telling jokes or, political commentary of looking more liberal than they are to protect themselves. Right. It seemed like they're on a team. But of course, so that would suggest, if you're self-censoring at that level, then maybe that's how you avoid experiencing problems in a department. But it's also, right, you're tearing at your own moral core as a human being when you do that at a certain level, particularly if you do it year after year. And the question becomes, do you even know who you are anymore? Or the thing that you are is something you aren't even willing to admit publicly. So, and then your research is biased, what you're writing on, your teaching is, of course, affected by it. So this all, I just sort of thought that, well, that's just a big open question to me that's hard to quantify as to what people actually are experiencing if you're self-censoring.
Right. Yeah. So for many of them, I think they were being prudent. Part of it is that they just don't know. So if you're in a department and people regularly make jokes about the limited intellectual ability of conservatives, you don't. It could be that if you said, well, I happen to be a conservative, they say, oh, that's interesting, and they wouldn't have a problem with it. But since they've been making these derogatory comments, the safer path, at least until tenure, is to remain silent. But then there is that question of after you've done that for so long, because you probably also self-censored in graduate school, and then you miraculously land a tenure track job, one of these rare things now, and so you're now desperately concerned about getting tenure. What kind of person will you be at the end of that? Now, I think that most of the people that we interviewed were very comfortable with their decision, and they said, well, it was kind of a trade-off I had to make, but I'm happy to speak out now, or as Harvey Mansfield said, you can now hoist the Jolly Roger once you get tenure. But there were a few where it did seem to affect them even after getting tenure. And that was, I think some of those were some of the sadder interviews that we conducted, because it really did have an effect on them. And I think some of the people that we interviewed, it was almost therapy for them. Because they've been silent for so long, and they only have 2 or 3 friends in their discipline who know, and we managed to get their name somehow. And then when they realized that we came in peace, that they could talk to us, and they unburdened themselves. Some of them actually said things to that effect, how liberating it was. So that was an interesting part of the research process.
Interesting to me in reading your book, not having been in academia myself, the decentralized or really lack of structure within an academic department. Of course, I've always heard about academic meetings and baton death march, things like that. But so many of the people reported not even having close friendships with really anyone in their department, or maybe a few. And it just
Right.
raised to my mind, one of person that you interviewed said, I don't even know the names of the new hires, recent hires.
Right.
And it sparked to my mind how easy it would be to hide, as opposed to if there were people out to get you, it's pretty easy to hide given that the sort of decentralized structure of teaching and governing.
Right. Yeah. Academia is actually a very kind of isolating existence, particularly at more research-oriented universities, where there's not an expectation that you're in the office 5 days a week, being available for students, like you might have at a liberal arts college. So if you're in a department of 30 to 40 people, my guess is that most people, they show up when they have office hours and when they teach, and that's about it. There might be others, they might come in for a couple other times every once in a while, just to do some things. But by and large, that's it. So academics, in a way, are almost like independent contractors. They just show up and they do their work. As long as you perform well on the standard metrics that we have of academic performance, get decent teaching evaluations, and get some publications out, you'll be fine. And so you don't have to be the most social or gregarious person to get by in academia. So it is very easy. I think that people in large research universities, in a way, have it easier, particularly if their research doesn't touch on hot-button political topics.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of, say, the good, the bad, and the ugly in your research, what's I mean, give us some quick hits. What was really ugly? What was really good? And what was bad?
Sure. So I thought the literature and sociology were the bleakest areas that we looked at, just because there were so few. In literature, we were able. Right, and it's not surprising. Literature, it was very difficult to find younger faculty. There's an old guard of literature professors who, in many ways, they became conservative because of changes to their discipline. That is, that as the discipline became politicized, even though they were they probably viewed themselves as good Democrats, it forced them to reevaluate their politics. Because they looked at their colleagues and said, well, if they're lining up on these things, maybe I should reconsider other areas. So as the study of literature became more politicized, it had a broader effect on them, making them more conservative politically. So those two were I think the bleakest. Although in sociology, there is still a small element of the discipline that views itself as a science. And so that means that it's usually just at larger research universities, and they're very quantitative. And one of the interesting things that we found was it was easier to find conservative sociologists at more prestigious Research One universities than at other universities, and that seemed to be because of you could do this very heavy-duty quantitative research on topics that weren't easily politically identifiable, and no one would figure it out. So you can still survive there. But elsewhere, sociology, they have this thing called public sociology, and almost I don't know what percentage, but a significant percentage of sociology job advertisements now will say that they want scholars who have of course, we want a profile in inequality. That's always one of them. But then they also say a profile in public sociology. And what that really means is political activism. That is, you're supposed to be going out there and spreading the good news of sociology with its disciplinary commitments, which are, of course, deeply political and grounded in largely Marxist ideas. And so that's obviously disqualifying from the start for conservatives. So that was kind of bleak. A kind of middle ground. I think that in philosophy, it was interesting. Even though there aren't a lot of conservative philosophers, many of them reported that the discipline itself was open to people who would make contrary arguments and do them in a clever and well-done way. And so if you did a good job, they thought that the discipline would largely reward you. Not always. but because of philosophy's commitment to argumentation and logic and reason, that if you could do that, then you could get an audience. History, it's worse than it is in, say, political science, but there's still some pockets where there have been, I think, some coalitions formed between people on the right and the left to, say, reinvigorate the study of political history. And so that was an interesting thing or an important thing that we found, is that in many disciplines, conservatives have been able to create some intellectual space to do their work. It's not obviously political space, but it's just so that they can address the kinds of questions that they would find interesting, which the discipline has decided aren't important anymore. And they've been able to, as I said, form coalitions with some on the left who recognize the importance of these questions. And then, of course, the bright spots were economics and political science. I came away from this project being grateful for my own discipline, even though I know there's serious problems within it. But I tell you, it's much easier to be a conservative political scientist than in any other discipline except for economics.
Well, it was interesting when you reported on a national conference of sociology that was about building narratives for utopia, and which just sounded absolutely bananas the way you described it. And I just think I'm just thinking of the fact you and I recently spoke at a conference for students on the problems of utopia, what utopian thinking has done, but then the American Political Science Association is sort of this great meeting of various groups and various panels. Maybe there's no central unifying ethos, but you can come and you can go to panels according to things that you like. And those panels that do really well in terms of attendance get more opportunities at subsequent meetings.
Right.
That fact alone suggests something.
Right. Yeah. So sociology, the theme of the conference when John and I went to it to interview some sociologists, and also just to kind of see what this discipline was like. The theme was real utopias. It was bizarre. And so they had all of these panels on this, and of course there was just endless discussion of the neoliberal university. It was just yes. So it was kind of a cross between an academic conference and a revival meeting. It was just very strange. Political science, as you mentioned, we will have themes, but no one really pays attention to those. I mean, no one cares. And then I am proud of the discipline. The discipline has adopted a principle of federalism, where you can start your own organizations if you show that there's interest in your organization or unit within the discipline. You can get panel space and meeting times, and then, as you said, if people show up, then you'll get more of them. And so it turns out that's a very healthy way to run a discipline. It kind of reduces conflict within it, rather than trying to centrally plan and control it and dictate to everyone what the discipline has to look like.
So I've been thinking, even also with political science, I mean, you have these enclaves, as you know, enclaves of conservative thinking, either rational choice, model, political science, or in political theory. One thinks of the Straussians largely having various departments or having significant numbers of people in various departments. Hillsdale just started a graduate program in political science, which is quite conservative, and so there's all those things are working as well. And maybe I guess the question is, but who are the ideas spreading, or is it just largely you're just talking to each other? But I mean, largely also you in the book, academic research not widely read.
Right. Yeah. If you get your mom and 3 friends to read it, you've beaten the averages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing, just in terms of, so is the PC University really the biggest threat to the long-term durability of higher education now, or is it a whole other? I mean, I know this is off topic, but it's a whole other range of problems facing the university, from declining student demand, depending upon your perspective, the potential rise of MOOC education, massive online open courses, and then sort of attempt to script the humanities professors script what you teach through
Right.
empirical evaluations, and just sort of all of these sort of demands that reshaping the university, and we may not know what universities are going to look like just as a whole a generation from now. And this sort of PC stuff is really, we can actually see a lot of liberals and conservatives banding together to try and defend a traditional core understanding of the
Right.
university. So, yeah, I mean, and I know your research isn't directed to that, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the PC threat, I think, is a threat. It might not be the largest, but if you look at what's happened to the University of Missouri since the protest there, and since the university kind of cravenly capitulated to these demands of these really pampered students, my understanding is that applications to the university are down significantly. Donations are down. Maybe people are canceling their season tickets to football and basketball games. I don't know. So it's been bad. So it does not look good for Missouri. So I think that is a threat, because most people, I think, naturally understand that this kind of petulance on the part of students shouldn't be rewarded, and it's antithetical to the idea of a university itself to cave into this kind of dictatorship from these angry,
social justice warriors,
very privileged, exactly, these privileged students. So one of the interesting things is I think most of the protests, professors haven't been involved, except for that one communications professor, I believe, at Missouri.
Who was fired.
Asking for muscle.
Yes.
Asking for people to assault a student journalist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but otherwise, you don't see faculty being the ones behind this. And my sense is that faculty are kind of alarmed by this on the left and the right. Of course, the right, they've always been alarmed by. The left, there was a blog post, I've forgotten the author's name, but he said something like, "I'm a liberal and my liberal students scare me, terrify me."
Yes.
Right. And so I think this is an area where you're going to see coalitions forming between conservative and liberal professors, progressive professors, because they all recognize what a threat it is to the nature of the university itself. As you mentioned, one of the bigger threats, I think, is this attempt to script everything with more and more quantitative assessments of what's going on in classrooms. And this is happening everywhere, and it's being pushed by accrediting agencies, and it's being pushed by the Department of Education. Margaret Spellings was a big supporter of this, and that's when you really, I think, once the Department of Education started pushing it, the problem became even worse. It was already starting to develop, and so you're seeing more and more demands for professors to have grading rubrics with their papers. That's one that my friends and we all complain about regularly. That, I think that's a problem. The MOOCs, I don't know that that's going to be a significant. I think that might plateau.
Okay.
That if tape recorders and cassettes didn't have profoundly disrupting effect on the university, then I'm not certain that online education is going to have much more of a disruptive effect on the university. So there'll be some demand for it, but in the end, there's still going to be significant demand for on-campus, face-to-face classroom teaching.
Interesting in the book, you and your co-author both come across as pro-tenure, and pro-tenure in particular for
right.
And what these professors said in their interviews. It was after tenure that they suddenly felt more free to, say, write for National Review or to work with conservative student groups, et cetera. So, but is the flip side of that, and maybe this is related to the discussion we're having, if we had a more free market academia, we had more churn, and we had more competition, and there wasn't this sort of course, this is all about the federal government now has nationalized the student loan industry, so we have a lot of cheap credit available to students. But if universities really were held accountable and had to compete and had to be very mindful maybe of who they employed. Could that actually work in the favor of, say, of conservatives and allowing them to have more opportunities to get into the university?
I think so. In fact, if somehow we could move to that kind of model for higher education, it would be a better environment for conservatives, or an easier environment for, I think, conservatives to get into higher education. I think the difficulty, though, is envisioning how you could move to that.
Yeah. Well, certainly the accrediting agencies. I mean, it seems to me those have to be
right.
leveled, and the way they exercise authority in higher education is
sure. They provide no meaningful service at all, other than employment for the people who work for them, as far as I can tell. And our accrediting agency is coming out here next year, and the list of demands that are being funneled down to the faculty to satisfy these people is just they're both bizarre and ridiculous. The accrediting agencies are, I think, a disaster on the whole. They just degrade the quality of higher education. But even if you got rid of the accrediting agencies, I'm not certain what would happen with tenure. Tenure would still survive. So I think that as things stand now, tenure is a very valuable institution for conservatives. Without it, conservatives would be the first ones shown the door in many places.
You say tenure. It seems to me tenure withers away now, under the threat of declining. I mean, particularly state colleges, declining state budgets. Could there be declining public demand? Right. I think we've seen declining.
Sure,
demand.
Sure, right.
And then you have the princes of higher academia, the people who hold these tenure positions. They're paid really well. They don't teach that much or as much as their other colleagues, and they become sort of this luxury good that maybe needs to be done away with. Do you see it? I mean, particularly if we look at law schools are right in the thick of this process I'm describing, and you see them, not even just not hiring, from what I'm hearing.
Right. Yeah. So that's correct. And in most universities, there's been a massive increase in the number of adjunct professors. And so, yes, that's now that then the question is the adjuncts, sometimes they do feel very vulnerable, because if you're let's say you're a conservative sociologist and you're an adjunct professor, that means that you're an at-will employee. So your department chair can fire you or refuse to rehire you at any point. And so in some ways they do feel vulnerable, I think, because of their adjunct status. Where even if once you have a tenure position, even if you aren't tenured, then there's this whole constellation of protections that are bequeathed on you just from having that tenured position. Where the adjuncts live in it's a kind of very precarious existence, and of course it doesn't pay well, and so they're often scrambling from one position to the next, teaching at 2 or 3 different universities, just trying to cobble together a paycheck that they can live off of. So that also, I think, would have the effect of leading to self-censorship on the part of conservatives, at least in some disciplines.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I suppose too, though, if you are able to move labor around in the absence of tenure, and you have some sort of criteria, so the free market university, I think, would lean more towards teaching than publications and scholarship. And so the German model starts to become a luxury that few universities can afford. Teaching matters, competency in teaching matters. And one could see the adjunct status changing and improving under that market model. Yeah. So
I think that's the case. Yeah. It's just, how do we move there from here? The university is a very, by nature, it's a conservative institution. It doesn't change quickly or rapidly. So that I think that would be the concern. Is you move to that, what happens between where we are now and then when you get to a really market driven model. what would happen to the
It would be interesting. It would be interesting if a number
campus.
of states tied funding to student choice rather than loading a given amount of money to various state colleges, but seeing where tying money to where students actually go.
Sure,
Would
sure.
be
And this is one. Yeah, I actually. So here in Colorado, that's largely happened. The
Okay.
state funding for higher education has declined dramatically, and so we've become much more enrollment and tuition driven at all state universities here in Colorado. And so the universities just can't count on the state to cover them if students aren't coming. So, and I also think that that's going to continue more as constituents become angry as they hear about things like, well, what's happening at the University of Missouri? Why should our tax dollars go to fund that? And so the left on the university campuses hasn't recognized how it's actually damaged its own financial future by being so politically homogenous.
Yeah. Well, and also, I mean, you think about it. I mean, I really didn't like the sort of clunky rhetoric from Marco Rubio or Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, and they're sort of just deploring humanities disciplines in favor of other more easily quantifiable disciplines. So you already see politicians are mindful of this, and various states, Texas and Wisconsin, stand out as higher education reform models that I think, from my mind, as someone who's was developed in the humanities, are problematic in a number of ways.
Yes.
And maybe you'd agree.
Right. Well, even President Obama has derided art history majors, I believe.
Yeah, art history majors. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you see? I mean, so I suppose in light of all of the research you've done, and maybe this discussion about how higher education is going to change, the position of the conservative going forward, do you think it largely stays as is within higher education, or do you see, are there good spots and bad spots potentially?
Right. So on balance, I think that you're going to continue to see the number or percentage of conservatives decline in most disciplines in the social sciences, humanities, except for economics and political science. And there's research on this. So Heterodox Academy, which I'm part of, this was started by Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist at New York University, and he became very concerned about the problems that political homogeneity creates for social science. And so he started Heterodox Academy. And so if you go to Heterodox Academy, it's this different post on sort of documenting how the Academy has been, at least in the social sciences, has become more liberal since the 1990s. Okay. So I think that in some sociology, unless something changes dramatically, I don't see a huge surge of conservatives going into sociology and then getting tenure track jobs, as much as I think it would be helpful, not only for conservatives but for the discipline of sociology itself. That's one of the things that we note in the book, is that the place where conservatives are probably needed most is where you find the fewest of them. I don't mind the fact at all that economics has a lot of conservatives and libertarians, but it would be helpful if there are some more libertarians and conservatives in some of these other disciplines. But I just don't know how you're going to get more conservatives to go into those disciplines and get jobs. So I think that's what you'll see in political science and economics. I think it's a much brighter future for conservatives.
Okay. Well, Joshua Dunn, thank you so much for talking with us today. The book is Passing on the Right: Conservative Professors in the Progressive University, co-authored with John Shields. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Grinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.